What if history's most celebrated empire hid one of its darkest secrets behind closed doors, silk curtains, and marble halls? Behind the roaring crowds of the Colosseum and the glory of military triumphs lived a class of men barely acknowledged in modern retellings, male concubines, men who were forced into submission not by the sword, but by the lust and power politics of the Roman elite. These were not merely lovers or entertainers. They were property, symbols of status, instruments of desire, and sometimes victims of horrifying abuse. Their stories were not recorded in marble or scrolls. They were whispered, shamed, and ultimately silenced. In the bustling flesh markets of ancient Rome, alongside baskets of figs and slabs of goat meat, human bodies were bought and sold like livestock. Boys as young as 8 or 9 were among the most sought after, selected not for strength or labor, but for their physical beauty, docility, and youth. Many of them were war captives, orphans, or born into slavery. Greek boys with delicate features and classical beauty were especially prized, but so too were the blonde-haired youths from Gaul and the olive-skinned Iberians, whose exoticism aroused Roman curiosity. Once selected, their fates were sealed by the exchange of coins and a nod from a wealthy patrician. They were removed from the world they had known, if they had won at all, and introduced to the opulent but brutal world of Rome's ruling class. Once acquired, the grooming process began. These boys were often referred to as delicati, meaning delicate ones, and were treated more like porcelain than people. Their body hair was meticulously removed using hot resins or abrasive stones. Their skin was oiled and perfumed. They were dressed in fine linens and taught how to walk, speak, and entertain like trained performers. A concubine's value wasn't just in the bedroom, it extended to public feasts, salons, and intimate gatherings where they were expected to dance, recite poetry, and even play instruments. They were elevated and displayed like artwork, yet owned and controlled like livestock. Some were even subjected to castration, an act done illegally, but often overlooked through bribes and imperial connections. Castrated boys retained their youthful appearance longer, and many Roman nobles wanted to preserve that illusion of innocence. The act was dangerous and painful, with high mortality rates, yet many wealthy men saw it as a necessary investment. Those who survived lived as eternal boys, robbed of identity, robbed of agency. Sex in ancient Rome was a tool of power. The culture's understanding of masculinity revolved around dominance and penetration. To be penetrated, especially if one was a freeborn Roman male, was seen as shameful, emasculating, and degrading. This cultural taboo did not extend to slaves or foreigners. Thus, the ownership of male concubines, while publicly frowned upon in theory, flourished in practice. Wealthy men ensured their concubines were either slaves or non-citizens, making it socially acceptable to use them as they pleased. For the concubines, daily life became a delicate performance. They were expected to be eternally compliant, affectionate, and grateful. Resistance was often met with whipping, starvation, or confinement. Some emperors kept entire harems of male concubines, each selected to suit different moods. These boys were paraded during festivals, ordered to serve during drunken Saturnalia orgies, or kept hidden in secret chambers for private entertainment. Their consent was irrelevant. Their bodies were public domains owned by powerful men. When these boys aged, their usefulness faded. A change in voice, a hint of facial hair, or a shift in physique marked the end of their service. The fortunate ones were reassigned as attendants or scribes. Many others were sold to brothels, sent to labor camps, or quietly disposed of. Rome's obsession with youth was ruthless, and the concubines paid the ultimate price for aging naturally. Some of the most powerful men in Roman history left disturbing legacies involving male concubines. Emperor Nero famously took a young boy named Sporus, had him castrated, and then married him in a grand public ceremony. Nero dressed Sporus in empress robes, called him "my wife," and displayed him like a trophy. Historians have debated whether this was madness, love, or cruelty, but to Sporus, it was a life sentence. Emperor Elagabalus took this even further. Known for his unpredictable behavior and extravagance, Elagabalus dressed as a woman, referred to himself as empress, and demanded sexual service from a rotating group of male partners. He is said to have offered vast rewards to anyone who could sexually satisfy him, turning the imperial palace into a cruel theater of submission. While some concubines became favorites and earned privileges, like finer clothes, better food, or private chambers, these rewards came at the cost of freedom and mental peace. Love in this dynamic was a dangerous illusion. Favor could disappear overnight. And when it did, so did protection. The concubine's role was not to feel, but to perform. A favorite one year could be dead the next. In some rare instances, concubines were used not just for pleasure, but for political leverage. A gift of a concubine could be a subtle insult or a form of flattery, depending on context. Entire alliances were formed or destroyed through such transactions. A beautiful concubine sent to a rival could function as a spy, a bribe, or a curse. Legally, concubines had no rights. The Lex Scantinia, the Roman law against certain sexual abuses, applied only to freeborn males. Slaves had no such protections. Their suffering was not considered a crime. Masters could do as they pleased, violate, mutilate, or murder them without fear of retribution. Even philosophers like Seneca, who advocated kindness toward slaves, rarely addressed the unique abuse endured by concubines. Their existence was buried beneath the laws of ownership and the culture of silence. Still, not all concubines accepted their fate passively. Some attempted escape. Others poisoned their masters or sought protection through unlikely patrons. A few succeeded. These survivors, once freed, often lived quiet, anonymous lives as scribes, shopkeepers, or temple workers. Their scars, physical and emotional, were permanent. One tombstone in Ostia bears a haunting epitaph from a freedman who once served in the imperial household, blinded for disobedience. His final words, carved in stone, read simply, "He died a man." Modern historians have only recently begun to acknowledge these stories. For centuries, the lives of male concubines remained unspoken, lost between the lines of military conquests and philosophical treatises. Their pain was real, their suffering immense, yet they were deemed unworthy of preservation. Today, through fragments of letters, poetry, and legal scrolls, their voices are beginning to surface. Not as footnotes, but as central figures in the darker chapters of Roman civilization. The story of Rome is not complete without them. It is a story of glory built on suffering, of statues standing tall above the graves of the silenced. And in this silence, the echoes of the male concubines still cry out, not just for pity, but for remembrance. The marble floors of Rome glistened under the golden sun, but in the corners where the light didn't reach, shadows grew thick and heavy. It was there, in the margins of palaces and villas, that the male concubines lived their final chapters, not with the grand exits of senators and emperors, but in quiet disappearance. Their stories, for the most part, ended not in revolution or redemption, but in erasure. This chapter peels back the last layer of gold from Rome's glory and lays bare the human cost of pleasure served cold, consumed hot, and then discarded. The fall from favor for a concubine was often sudden. The same eyes that once watched their every move with desire now passed over them with disinterest or contempt. A new boy might arrive, younger, softer, more obedient, and suddenly the favorite became obsolete. The lucky few were given minor posts as household servants or attendants. These men became invisible within the architecture of Roman life, managing scrolls, tending to lamps, pouring wine at banquets they once starred in. Others weren't as fortunate. The removal of a concubine was frequently permanent. A whisper, a nod, a dark corridor, then silence. Abandonment came in many forms. Some were sold off to brothels in Sabura, where they served the city's underbelly until disease or violence claimed them. Others were quietly shipped to the mines or galleys, sentenced to a labor death for the sin of aging or no longer pleasing the eye. For Rome had no use for love without performance, no place for men who could no longer be used for display or desire. In a city built on spectacle, even pain had to entertain or be eliminated. Some concubines, marked by trauma, turned to madness. Their lives, constructed by obedience and false affection, collapsed once their purpose ended. A few wandered the streets, muttering in Greek or Aramaic, speaking to invisible patrons or lost friends. Romans avoided them, not out of compassion, but superstition. Madness was feared, not pitied. A former imperial concubine named Nestor, once a favorite of a wealthy merchant, was found living beneath a broken aqueduct. When asked who he was, he whispered only, a voice, nothing more. To the people of Rome, that's all he had ever been. And yet, some resisted the fate written for them. These rare souls became ghosts within the empire, carving out lives in the city's cracks. Some became spies for senators, using the secrets they'd overheard during whispered pillow talk to trade for survival. Others turned to religion, Mithraism, Christianity, even Isis worship, seeking in the sacred what was denied in the flesh. For them, faith was both escape and transformation. One freed concubine, converted to the early Christian faith, later died as a martyr during Nero's persecution. To his fellow believers, he was a saint. To Rome, he was just another vanished pleasure. The burden of memory was immense for those who lived on. In Roman culture, a man was judged by honor, ancestry, and public contribution. A concubine had none of these. They were owned, not born into status. They served, not fought. They obeyed, not governed. Even in freedom, their past clung to them. In the baths, whispers followed them. In the forums, eyes shifted away. They were neither citizen nor slave, neither noble nor common. They were fragments of other men's stories, leftovers from other men's passions. What's worse, even in death, they were denied dignity. Most male concubines were buried in unmarked graves or mass pits outside the city gates. Their names lost, their identities dissolved. The rituals of Roman burial, the coin for Charon, the libations, the carved epitaphs, were rarely granted to them. And yet, archaeologists have found small tokens buried with some of these anonymous bodies: a carved ring, a strip of embroidered cloth, a bronze mirror. Hints of a life once gilded, then shattered. Remnants of a self remembered, even in secret. Despite this, not all Roman society was blind to the cruelty. Philosophers like Epictetus, a former slave himself, hinted at the inhumanity of sexual slavery in his teachings. While he didn't directly condemn concubinage, doing so would have been dangerous. He spoke of the soul's imprisonment and the falsehood of pleasure built on suffering. The Stoics preached freedom of the inner self, but for a concubine with no control over their body, these words could ring hollow. The law, too, began to shift, slowly, inconsistently. By the later imperial period, certain edicts tried to regulate the treatment of slaves, especially those kept for special purposes, but enforcement was minimal. The elite found ways around the rules, and so the suffering continued, codified, controlled, but never truly confronted. Rome's own literature betrays this hidden world. Petronius, in his Satyricon, paints grotesque caricatures of pleasure and ownership, with young boys dancing naked at banquets, performing for drunk senators and aging matrons. Martial's epigrams joke about delicate boys traded between men like trinkets. Even Ovid's love poems occasionally touch upon the bodies bought for delight, though always in passing, never in judgment. But the most damning evidence comes not from satire or law, but from silence. The concubines are absent in the grand histories, the triumphal arches, the imperial coins. Their absence is their testimony. For a civilization that documented everything, from the size of aqueducts to the shape of a general's nose, the absence of a voice speaks volumes. It tells us they were not considered worthy of memory, which makes remembering them now an act of defiance. In truth, the story of the male concubine is not just Roman. It echoes across cultures and empires. In the Ottoman harems, the Chinese courts, the Persian palaces. But in Rome, the contradiction was starkest. Here was a civilization that prided itself on law, citizenship, and virility, yet hid behind its pillars a system of exploitation that devoured beauty and spat out broken men. Some modern scholars have attempted to reclaim these lives, piecing together names and stories from inscriptions, personal letters, and imperial gossip. The work is painstaking, often speculative, but necessary because these men lived. They loved, suffered, and sometimes even found moments of joy. Their laughter, though rare, echoed through the marble halls. Their tears, though hidden, stained the silks. Today, in the museums of Rome, behind the statues and sarcophagi, we see the faces of emperors, generals, gods. But perhaps, if we look closer, we might find something else. A sandal worn thin, a bracelet too small for a soldier, a comb with teeth worn from nervous hands. Traces of the forgotten, hints of the horrific, reminders of those who were once desired, devoured, and discarded. Rome may have turned them to ashes, but history now offers them light.